2. The train that brings the magical children to the school is due. It is the first day of September. I put away my sketchbook and look out of my round tower window to the south. Another 8 hours and the children from all corners of the United Kingdom would step off at Hogsmeade and make their way to the school. That day I remember as clear as if I was there again, standing there, by the stone-framed window, the ground below falling away to low scrubland and a large hut belonging to the gamekeeper. Beyond that, a forest, vast and dense. It is a view I had looked on for 8 weeks, as I learned what my job from Professor Burbage was to be, summer sun throwing its glorious light over the landscape, my sparse possessions given to me in haste by Professor Dumbledore in Cornwall, books, clothes and the like. And also Darklin, our family cat, my childhood companion, still spry and sleek, who had at once coiled around my legs in affection and was barely far away from me in those years that we were at the school. My parents, my brother occupied my thoughts in the early days to the exclusion of the nuances of the castle, ghosts and the moving staircases. The children's pure joy of learning magic were just in the peripheral of my mind. I was not required at the feast. My presence would be explained by Miss Burbage once the children attended lessons. A few days before, the nature of my abilities was disclosed to a small group of staff, key teachers who would need to know of my magiclessness. The 4 heads of house took it without question, and Professor Burbage, their witch of around 30 years old, with whom I would be working the most. I was to be in her company most of the time for, through my magiclessness, many aspects of wizard life, such as food, doors and stairs and the perimeter of the castle would be inaccessible to me. Rebus Hagrid was also to be informed, as well as Argus Filch, the caretaker, who seemed to hate me on sight. The only comment, above the congratulations from the staff, had been from Severus Snape, the tall, terse, hook-nosed, black-haired head of Slytherin House, and potions teacher, wondering aloud what the point was. Professor Burbage told me to take no notice of him. Severus Snape was surly with everyone. I did notice, after a time, that he and Professor Burbage were not surly with one another. I held Professor Burbage in high regard as a model witch, always kind and patient with me, both in and out of lessons, instructed I should assist the students when they were struggling in the practical aspects, and the written tasks. All of the students at the school were expected to take the subject, but many refused, and took extra transfiguration lessons instead. The children's ability in mole studies varied, of course, due to their home life and background, and I introduced myself as Professor Burbage's assistant, and they let me help them. I was there, wizard robes on, in the classroom, part of their lesson life. Often, my first job of the day was to visit the next-door classroom, that in which defense against the dark arts was taught, to request that a silencing spell was placed on the adjoining wall. I began to dread this for the task as the days drew on. Something, a feeling, altogether frightening, lingered there with the teacher, Professor Quirrell, who, on the face of it, would do what I asked, but a dark sense of unease always stayed me for hours afterwards, as if a scorpion skulked in the darkness, plotting its opportunity to strike. When lessons were not in progress, I kept myself away, and in my room, drawing the landscape, as I hoped that that day would be the day I would get news of my parents. It was the kind Professor Burbage who, on learning of my brother, took me to visit him. I sat and spoke to him, but he did not respond. I took his hand, but his fingers did not curl around mine, as they did Mum's. The head healer, on hearing I was here, was pleased to tell me his care had been met with gold. My gold, I thought as we flew to Hogwarts, from my wages, caring for him. It took until Christmas until I heard anything about my parents. It had not been an uneventful term. A troll had broken into the castle, which was both alarming and thrilling, and I grew to love the game of Quidditch, and I remember the very first one I saw. That boy, who was to have the shadow of this thing over his whole life, had had a spell put on his broom, but he still managed to overcome it to catch the snitch. I asked after my parents. They were to be tried under the wizard court for high treason. I could not visit them, Dumbledore explained, but I was allowed to flew them under supervision. Looking into the green flames, and into the living room I knew so well, It was an immediate comfort to look upon first the face of my father and then my mother. That lasted mere minutes, for when they spoke to ask how I was and whether I had visited my brother, they looked far older than their true years, far more fragile, and I wanted to reach out, to touch them, to hold them and do what I could to ease their suffering. Dumbledore advised me not to discuss specifics, otherwise the ministry would terminate my connection. As it was, the flu call was short enough and I had barely time to wish them love for Christmas when the grate grew dark. It was at that moment I had decided what to do with my life, find out what they were accused of and fight on their behalf. It is what my brother would have done, I was sure. I was working here for his continued care, there must be something I could do for my parents. Christmas came and I stayed at Hogwarts. Several of the staff did too, otherwise I might have starved. I was indeed kept company by Professor Burbage, who had arrived back after Boxing Day to do her work, and we went out walking in the snowy, icy grounds. She told me about her mole parents and how she had come to work here. She had worked in the mole world as a nurse but wanted to stop the ignorance of wizards by educating them. I told her I was adopted and Dumbledore had made me an unrefusable offer to support my brother. I was glad she was around. She was good to talk to. She kept me grounded and helped me into my room. My door kept being locked, and when I went to see the caretaker, Filch pointed out with a triumphant snarl that he had been told it was to be open in term time only. 3 nights in the whole holiday I had to spend uncomfortably on chairs in the staff room. The library was similarly blocked, so I could not begin any work towards my parents' cause. But I could begin with their biographies, namely, finding out about them and noting it down. I knew embarrassingly little, and, when I eventually got to the library, a big volume on the Ministry of Magic recorded them in one sentence, Edmund and Elsie Pemberton, that they worked in counterintelligence during the Second World War. When term began again, we, as staff, were told that Hagrid's dog Fluffy had been put on guard on the 3rd floor, something which became more important as the year went on. I spoke to my parents on many occasions that year, and inertia seemed to have bedded in. The ministry did not seem to be in a hurry to try them. I was unable to ask them directly about it and was stuck with the weather, my father's runner-bin plants and the cricket. Later on in the school year, and my routine of support teaching, walking and drawing, being sneered at by Snape and thoroughly spooked by Quirrell was interrupted with the realization that 3 young students had overcome a series of obstacles to find whatever Fluffy had been guarding. To everyone's horror it emerged that Quirrell had been parasitized by the most terrible wizard known as He Who Must Not Be Named, and had tried to attack and kill Harry Potter. A deeper magic, Miss Burbage had explained to me, had kept him from harm, namely motherly love. The main thing, though, which would not leave my mind, was that he did have a name by which my parents knew him, Tom. I made a point of exchanging a few words with Harry Potter before he left for the summer, and told him that he had been brave and his parents would have been proud. I told him I had been adopted as a baby and had never known my parents either. It was then that he said a curious thing. He told me that the coming was the going. When I asked him what he meant, he said he didn't know, it was just in his mind. That summer I was delighted when Miss Burbage offered for me to spend the holidays with her, and she promised to help me in any way she could with my parents. 88,888,888. It took until halfway through the summer holidays before any news came from Mum and Dad. They had been allowed to flew me at Miss Burbage's cottage near the sea in Dorset and had been delighted to tell me that some of the charges had been partially dropped. My mother thanked Miss Burbage for showing me much kindness. I heard her part of the conversation back to Mum insisting that they called her Charity, please. They had written to Dumbledore too with their thanks. It had been to my shame that I had only managed to visit my brother once in the holidays, for I had to rely on Miss Burbage to take me, but she had flew the hospital for me and I found out that there was no change in my brother's condition. I asked the head healer about it, and, surprised, she asked, "Didn't you know? Poor Ashcroft was born like this. His parents were barred in law from having children because they were both pure blood, which carries a genetic risk. By all accounts, though, they did not realize it at the time, poor people, it being the war and everything. Sometimes wars make people forget everything." She patted my hand. His illness did not develop until he was an adult, though. He will be mentally and physically incapable for the rest of his life. You are a good person for supporting him. Our ward is unfunded by the ministry for the type of illnesses we have here. I did wonder what was going to happen when your parents' assets were frozen. Here's such a dear, sweet man. I've cared for him since he was a boy, when your mum first brought him, so kind and considerate. A boy to make any parents proud. She suspected, you know, long before any symptoms showed. It took me a long time after that conversation to think about things properly again. My parents' son was disabled because of their heritage. They were pure blood wizards and this was dangerous. Was this the reason they had been arrested? Why now, when their son had been unwell for over 20 years? Perhaps, then, adopting me was a way to console themselves after Ashcroft had been taken ill. Yet, the parents I knew were not like that. They had sent me to mole schools, had supported me, loved me, sacrificed time for me. Yet, how many people knew I was a mole? I bet the ministry didn't. But, given that they had allegedly broken the law having my brother, I was hardly something to just casually tell the ministry about. Legally, I did not exist, and Dumbledore knew that. And it was terrible to think those things about Mum and Dad before they had a chance to tell me themselves. And yet, I felt there was more to it than that. The ministry may frown upon children born of pure-blood parents. I understood the concept of two people being so closely related that their offspring would suffer genetic abnormalities. But to make it illegal? There must be something more. I was right, but it took me a long time to discover what it was. The start of term began with the arrival of the Hogwarts train and, a few hours later, Harry Potter and Ron Weasley driving an enchanted Ford Anglia. It had been a house elf which had stopped them getting onto the train, they'd claimed, which made sense. I had met house elves before and they were tricky little creatures. Dora's family had one, taking instructions at face value, as if this amused them. It was a pity about the car, as I found it months later, having been mangled by the willow tree in the school grounds, a home to a large family of spiders. Later, I tried to get it going again. The engine looked very much like the one on Dad's Ford Prefect. Those few weeks back at term I was pleased to be out of the castle and drawing, away from opportunities to ask about my parents, for I knew that if there was news I would be told, and away from the insufferable Lockhart, whose door I had to knock on daily to ask him to do the soundproofing spell, which, unlike Quirrell, he could never do properly. It confused him that I had never heard of him, and tried to make me stay to hear about his brave deeds of daring-do. He was not a teacher with whom my heritage had been shared, and I was glad of it. Often, I went down to Quidditch pitches to watch practice and draw. On one occasion, Professor Dumbledore had called me up from there to his office to inform me what the students had been told, after the message, written in blood, had appeared in the corridor. I had not taken it in at first, thinking that he had called me because of my parents. "You may go to visit them," Dumbledore said, after I'd listened to him tell me about the Chamber of Secrets. "It is nearly Christmas and it seems the Minister for Magic is not pressing on them about their alleged crimes." While the caretaker's cat and two boys were petrified by an unknown attacker, I was elated. I was going home, and could see my parents at last, after nearly 18 months. There was so much to tell them, and discuss. Less happily was my encounter with Snape, who accused me of stealing from the potions stores. I was horrified. What had he any idea that I would steal, let alone potions ingredients for something I could not make? I appealed to Miss Burbage, who went directly to Dumbledore. I denied all charges of theft of course, and told Dumbledore to check my belongings. This was done, and of course, nothing was found. Bristling, Snape apologized to me brusquely, shooting a look at Miss Burbage. I was outraged. What had any of this to do with me? It was useless my taking them, something which I pointed out to Dumbledore, and, as I had no one to give them to, they would be just a load of herbs and spices and bits of dead animal. No one could have wished for Christmas more than me, to get out of this school, sinking as it was into a depression over the Chamber of Secrets and the heir of Slytherin, and back home. Christmas Eve came and the students went. Miss Burbage offered to fly me back, which I readily agreed to. It was so good to be home, that was certain. My parents helped me feel as welcome as ever, and we hugged so long and hard though I would break their ribs and they mine. I was able to stay for the whole holiday, and panicked because I had no time to get them presents. Having you back is present enough, Helianthus, Dad said, something I may have cringed at a few years ago, but knew exactly what he meant. I had brought my sketchbooks home and Mum marveled at the landscapes of Hogwarts. It was as she remembered, she said. They were prevented from doing magic at the moment, while under house arrest. Otherwise they might have attempted to animate the Quidditch game I had painted, the one where Harry Potter had his arm broken and the liability that was Lockhart had removed all of his bones instead of mending them. I had captured that dark little scene at the bottom. You have been so good, I could never have asked for anyone better, if you were truly our own. Dad looked at Mum sharply, then did a spell, voiceless, and invisible, and it felt to me as if we were in a sort of cocoon. We sat, in the living room, on a three-piece suite, Mum looking earnestly at Dad. Then, she said, we really ought to tell her, Edmund, as much as she needs to know. Security, Dad said, when he saw me looking around at the invisible field of force. An ancient spell. Undetectable. And then he began to discuss their role in the war, how they had met back up again at the ministry, having known each other at Hogwarts, and due to their exceptional magical abilities had been assigned roles outside the civil service, in counterintelligence. Coincidentally, that was when the Second World War began, I said, but Dad tushed and tutted saying, coincidence? That was no coincidence. The wizard whom we were to infiltrate had steadily built up that enmity between Muggles. Have you heard of the wizard Grindelwald? I shook my head at first, then paused, picturing myself in the Mole Studies classroom handing back a chocolate frog card to a young first year that he had dropped. Dumbledore defeated the wizard Grindelwald in 1945, I read, through my thoughts. Indeed he did, Dad replied. And we helped, at counterintelligence. We tracked the movement of Grindelwald and his followers. We raided houses and meeting places. But none of us in the ministry could do what Dumbledore did. He changed sides, or appeared to. He got as close to Grindelwald as possible, and then, at his most vulnerable, when he was organizing his last battle, to strike with the Mole fascists against moles, Dumbledore assassinated him. I saw it, with my own eyes. I was with the greater good wizards, their mark, the Deathly Hallows, on their sleeves, all saluting. Dumbledore turned to him and, Dad lowered his voice, used the Avada Kedavra curse. I sat there for a little while, next to them, on Mum's floral sofa as they told me. Mum and Dad had infiltrated the greater good wizards to defeat them, helped Dumbledore to defeat Grindelwald. We watched the greater good wizards disperse. A lot rounded up, even your father. Mum looked across to Dad. It took the Minister for Magic himself to visit and release your father personally from Azkaban. And that is the reason. Mum lowered her eyes and Dad held her hand. We were handsomely rewarded, of course, and then pensioned off. But people still remembered. People still suspected we had really been greater good wizards. And now, as it seems that he who must not be named is staging an attempted return, Cornelius Fudge is taking no chances with the old rumor. You see, greater good wizards, who had followed Grindelwald were encouraged to have as many pure-blood children as they could, and a lot of those wizards went on to join he who must not be named, inspired as he was by Grindelwald, either when released from Azkaban, having changed their names, of course, or those who were never found. Of course, with your father's family history. That's enough, Elsie, said my father, a sharp look at me. That's enough for her to deal with. But of course, you have questions. Yes, I nodded. I had questions. It took me a few moments to arrange them in my head before looking at Dad. What have you been arrested for? I began. As a precaution, Dad replied, reaching for my mother's hand again. But even Cornelius Fudge could not find anything to actually charge us for. We are a reminder to him that sworn intelligence employees can be suspected of treason, and not to trust anyone. He has tried to find evidence against us from the war, but there is none. We did our duty, nothing more. Anything else is circumstantial. Dumbledore knows this. This is why he helped us by helping you. If I had had more time to think then, and ask my parents some more, I might have discovered the truth somewhat faster than when I did. But Dad, eager to shake off the spell that kept us hidden, soundproof, like a cloak, said that he needed to reverse it, lest the ministry were monitoring us just at this moment and couldn't find us. So I told them about Snape accusing me of stealing potions ingredients, and the Chamber of Secrets and the petrified children. I saw a look pass between my parents, one whose meaning was only known to them, and then Dad spoke. He may have suspected you were bringing them to us. The school is under threat from you-know-who. Slytherin's chamber was opened once before. A girl was murdered by him. Any association, however tenuous, is now suspect. But I could never have taken them, I pointed out. I have no magic with which to open the door, and I could never know what I was taking even if I had been looking for something. And now you know how guilt by association works, Helianthus, said my father. That you are our daughter, no matter that you were adopted, brought to the school by Dumbledore and working to keep your brother cared for is enough for some people. And that was all that was said on the subject for the whole holiday. Snow came, and there was little reason to leave home. I drew the winter scenes, how the flakes had fallen and formed patterns of their own. And then came the day I had to return to work, knowing I had to leave my parents again, not knowing the next time I would see them. You may be in Azkaban, I cried, as Miss Burbage circled on her broom waiting for me. Let them try. Dad scoffed, but, as I hugged them both goodbye, I could tell they were not quite so certain. I was in a state of depression when I returned to Hogwarts, which even painting and drawing did not help. I put my art bag angrily away one Saturday afternoon when I couldn't get the shape of the far-off Cairngorms right, kicked out at the door, scared Darklyn and, wishing I had pulled on a coat, stalked down the south path towards Hagrid's hut. I then remembered he had been taken to Azkaban prison in relation to the Chamber of Secrets and veered off north, chancing upon a sky blue, beaten-up car which was clearly under a locomotion spell, zooming around as it was in a small clearing. When I had got close enough to it that I could leap into the passenger seat, I located the lever which turned off the bewitchment and the car became still, dropping a little to the ground, like a child deflating after a manic half an hour high on E-numbers. Cobwebs festooned most of the corners, rust was beginning to set in under the wheel arches and fungi was beginning to grow in the inside passenger door sill, and I thought of the collectors who would love this vintage Ford car, someone. The mule version of my father and his gardening, taking the time and effort to restore it. Over the next few months, when my father and mother came to mind, and I felt I needed to let off steam, I would come down to the car, which gave me the impression it was as pleased to see me as I was to see it. I ordered small parts and materials to stop the worst of the damage getting even worse, but it was unlikely to help the car being stuck out in damp conditions. My caring for the car stopped very suddenly one afternoon when I was confronted by a huge spider sitting on top of it, its legs splayed like a grabber in an arcade machine. I knew enough not to get close and did not return for several months. The spider had gone and I had done all I could for the car. It could zoom around to its engine's content as restored as I could possibly make it, its windows still smashed and its paintwork dented and scratched. Turning back, I was astonished to see two figures heading deep into the forest, unmistakably students. I couldn't decide whether to follow them or return to find a teacher, but I did neither. A few minutes later the figures were followed by the car, switching on its lights which I'd mended and tearing away into the forest. No less than 10 minutes later, as I was striding back towards the castle, the car emerged, carrying the students, who I could clearly see to be Harry Potter, and his friend Ron Weasley, who were promptly ejected from the car at the edge of the forest before it disappeared into its interior. A few days later, the same boys were being almost universally celebrated as being the ones to have overcome the monster, a basilisk, Professor Dumbledore told us, and rescuing Ginny Weasley. When that staff meeting was over, to inform us of the facts, a derisive HRMPH from Snape followed Dumbledore asked me to remain behind. He explained to me that a memory, one belonging to Voldemort, had been preserved in diary for the last 50 years, and had been channeled by Ginny to reopen the chamber. She had been possessed, Dumbledore explained, beginning a circumnavigation of his office. although I suspect how. I have to ask you, Miss Pemberton, did you bring anything back to this castle when last you visited your parents? I shook my head. Did they ask you specifically to do something while you were here? An instruction, or a task? Again, I shook my head, then asked, am I being accused of something? Not in the least, Dumbledore said. When you told them about the Chamber of Secrets being opened again, I remember him asking, though I knew then as I know now, that I had never mentioned the discussion I had had with my parents at Christmas to anyone. What did they say? They said that it had been opened before, and a child who had had mole parents was murdered. I remember staring at him for a long time, as he continued to pace. And the murderer? I shook my head. No, perhaps they wouldn't. They love you more than they could possibly have loved any child, even if you were born to them. I felt myself redden at his words, as I thought of my parents again. But Dumbledore fell silent, looking into the middle distance. Then, he stared at me. Miss Burbage praises your excellent work this year, even taking some lessons on your own. I nodded. Miss Burbage is going away for a sabbatical year, Dumbledore continued. Who is to be her replacement? The one person I could think would be excellent for the job. It would mean a pay rise, of course. He continued to look at me, until the canute dropped. Me? I was stunned. Dumbledore wanted me to teach. You, Dumbledore said, firmly. If you think I am up to the job, I nodded, the implications of teaching rather than just assisting flooding into my mind all at once, begging me to analyze them all, not least the thought telling me, shouting at me that I was a mole. You are adjacent Professor McGonagall and next year's Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, he explained, telling me that Lockhart was now permanently incapacitated following his attempted assistance of Harry and Ron in the Chamber of Secrets. You will be attached to the Hufflepuff House, Professor Sprout will be informed. Assuming you accept the position. Accept the job of a teacher? A part of my brain began to panic. But then, it calmed, like a rough sea on a still day, light flooding into my mind. Yes, I nodded, I do accept. But... Yes? Dumbledore waited for me to continue, patience showing in every sinew. I have nowhere to go this summer. Miss Burbage told me she was going abroad for the whole holiday. I assume that is part of her sabbatical, and my parents are still under house arrest, so I can't return there. Last year I stayed with her, but, Dumbledore held up a hand. In the same way that you began, 2 years ago, consider Hogwarts your home. Thank you, I nodded, but did not turn to go. Dumbledore waited for me to continue. A good trick, one I always tried to emulate as a teacher, though never mastered. My parents told me they were suspects from when they fought with you in the war. Is that why Professor Snape accused me of theft? Because I didn't, and Dumbledore held up a hand. Severus is perfectly clear that you are innocent of anything, he replied, slowly, but yes, your parents' history with Grindelwald is now the Ministry's current concern. They said they fought for you. Can you not speak for them? Oh, I have, said Dumbledore, believe me. Cornelius has his own ideas. So, do you accept my terms? Work as my Mole Studies teacher for 1 year, with an increase in salary? Yes, Professor, I nodded. I do accept. Welcome then, Professor Pemberton, teacher of Mole Studies.